Okay, let me begin by asking a very difficult question. Is Buddhist awakening possible? No doubt a profoundly difficult question, possibly one without a clear rational answer. We are perhaps reliant on meditative practice and failing that, statements of religious belief. It is not clear if philological or philosophical inquiry have any role to play at all. But perhaps philology and philosophy can be of some use, at least in helping us form an intellectually satisfactory position. We can surely inquire into old texts and ideas in such a way as to form an idea about their plausibility. Maybe this is what Buddhism advises us to do anyway. An important message of the Eightfold Way is right view precedes right mindfulness and right absorption. Getting one's ideas right in the beginning is therefore of crucial importance. Having wrong view will result in wrong mindfulness and wrong absorption, and awakening, as understood by the Buddha, will not be possible. So Buddhism tells us that serious meditative practice requires inquiry. Perhaps most importantly of all, it is important to inquire into the ideas and practice of Buddhist meditation. And yet a question such as what is the meaning of Buddhist meditation usually evokes predictable responses depending on personal disposition, whether one tends towards traditional faith or rational skepticism. You see some of the possibilities here. The traditionalist will simply say, meditation is about purifying the mind, attaining insight, and ending suffering. More recently, a secular rationalist might say, meditation, the purpose of meditation is to understand the mind, to correct faulty activity, and bring about well-being. For the atheist, there of course is no meaning. Meditation is meaningless religious ritual, in which some might falsely invest meaning through sheer fantasy. For the traditionalist, the meaning or point of Buddhist meditation is settled. Quietening of the mind in order to attain insight. The secular rationalist imagines a less exalted form of this. It's a similar idea, but it doesn't go so far. The point is to try and understand the mind and correct pathological features of it. So I would suggest that we put the atheist response to one side. It really does not add anything to the debate. Apart from these responses, these typical responses, our purpose here is different. We want to know if the Buddhist concept of awakening is philosophically coherent, both in terms of its own aims and practices, and also when viewed from the modern perspective of what we now know about the human being and the world. In other words, we are asking whether Buddhism is possibly true, a plausible and coherent system of ideas, values and practices, which might in the end stand as good a chance as being viewed as truth as science. An open inquiry into the concept of awakening is therefore an investigation of ideas, an assessment of their inner coherence, as well as their plausibility when viewed in terms of other forms of knowledge. And most obviously of all, in order to understand awakening, the ideas we must study concern meditation. Among the plethora of Buddhist meditative traditions, which ideas should we focus on? Well, we can start, I think, by noting the curiosity that the traditional and secular positions are not very far apart. In both, we find more or less the same ideas. Both insist on insight enabled by varying degrees of calm. If any theory of Buddhist meditation could claim to be standard, it is probably this: the idea that calming the mind through meditative concentration gives it access to truth or truths. This is the standard theory of Theravada and Mahayana forms of Buddhism. It was also the Indian Buddhist norm, which was then transmitted to Tibet and East Asia. The same idea animates the various secular forms of mindfulness now proving so popular. So the ubiquity of calm and insight provides an easy decision about the focus of our inquiry. The simple answer is this. We will start at the beginning. We will inquire into texts that record the genesis of the idea of calm and insight. Focusing on origins is not merely because we stand a better chance of understanding an idea at its birth. It is also because we have reason to doubt the authenticity of the calm insight ideal. It might be a non-Buddhist intrusion which has distorted an earlier understanding. So this is our remit. In these lectures, this is what I will be trying to do. Our focus is a philosophical investigation into early Buddhist meditation, as recorded in the Pali discourses, the only complete discourse literature in an Indian dialect to have survived. What I mean by a philosophical investigation is to analyze the ideas, occasionally with reference to other systems of knowledge, such as modern philosophy and cognitive science, but the focus is mainly on the logic of the Buddhist ideas, seen from within the tradition, understanding the conceptual relations between them. In the end, we will hopefully be in a position to say something sensible about whether Buddhist awakening is a plausible and desirable goal. Understanding truth demands that we ask difficult questions, so let us start by immediately challenging the consensus. One of the most mysterious statements of the Buddha, which has been misunderstood by exegetes past and present, occurs in the Brahmajala Sutta. It's the very first sutta in the Pali Canon. At the conclusion of this discourse, and almost as a coda to it, the Buddha has this to say about his liberated state. The body of the Tathagata remains bhikkhus, but its connection with being has been severed. As long as his body remains, gods and men see him. When the body breaks up, after life has been exhausted, gods and men do not see him. There are a number of statements like this in the Pali Canon where the Buddha talks about being seen and witnessed by gods and men. This is unusual. This talks about the body of the Buddha. And one would like to translate the word bhava as becoming. I've translated it as being. And then we could understand this as an entirely normal statement of liberation. Of course, the Buddha no longer has a connection with becoming because his awakening means he cannot be reborn again. However, the subject of this statement is the Buddha's body. And it makes no sense to talk about a body having a connection or not to rebirth. So T.W. Rhys Davids' translation makes no sense, unfortunately. The outward form, brethren, of him who has won the truth stands before you, but that which binds it to rebirth is cut in twain. If we follow Rhys Davids, he'd be saying that the Buddha's body has lost its connection to rebirth. Of course, the body cannot be reborn. Buddhaghosa also fails us by taking the claim as a general statement about the Buddha's liberation through cultivating the path. So Buddhaghosa's comment on this, well actually there's quite a lot of comment on it, this is the essential part. His connection to being has been severed. This means for him the connection with being has been severed by the sword that is the path of an arahant. But of course a body cannot cultivate the path. Buddhaghosa here understands the subject as the Buddha, not his body. So he identifies thirst for being as the rope or connection, although a person as a whole can be said, only a person as a whole can be said to be the subject of desire, not the body. So in a simple logical point, the body does not desire. It is the human being, enabled by the body. We are forced to conclude the Buddha is talking about the somatic implications of the liberated state. The simile which follows confirms this. It is just like bhikkhus, when a bunch of mangoes is cut off at the stalk. Whatever mangoes are connected to the stalk, they all follow the bunch as it falls. Just as the mangoes are connected to a mango tree by a stalk, which is severed, so too is the connection of the Buddha's body to being severed. Just as mangoes remain in a condition disconnected from the mango tree, so too does the Buddha's body remain lingering in a condition disconnected from the tree of being. Of course, we are reminded of the Chandogya Upanishad passage, where the Chandogya Upanishad makes a very similar statement to this. What does this mean? For now, we merely note that the Buddha's physical state should not be overlooked in any account of Buddhist liberation. Awakening is not simply a psychological transformation, the cessation of greed, hatred, anger, conceit, ignorance, and so on. It happens to the entire individual, the human being as a whole. If the body is part of the liberating experience, it implies that body and mind are part of an experiential whole, and if so, sentience would seem to be entangled in embodiment, perhaps irreducibly so. Strange as this may seem, exactly this point is made in another mysterious statement of the Buddha, which is here underneath. This is quite famous, but I think people have missed some of the main points of it. But I do not say, sir, that making an end of suffering occurs without reaching the end of the world. And yet, sir, I declare the world, its arising, cessation, and the way thereto, occurs in this very fathom-long corpse, endowed with perception and mind. We are not yet concerned with what it means to reach the end of the world. Here we merely note the peculiar idea of a sentient corpse. The word for corpse is calavera, a term cognate with the Latin cadaver. They're basically the same word. And the use of this suggests a morbid ascetic inclination. Now that I think of it, I think there must be some contrast with the Upanishads, where consciousness is that which enlivens and brings to life the body, and without that, the body is dead. The Buddha is turning that directly back against the Upanishadic thinkers. He's comparing the body, which is sentient, to something dead. Consciousness is not the enlivening thing, in other words. Anyway, the Buddha does not refer to a person's consciousness or mind, or even a mind-body relationship. He instead refers to the human being primarily in terms of embodiment, seated within which is sentience. The terms sanya and manas are used extremely generally. Consciousness or sentience seems here to be inseparable from embodiment. A similar expression is found in a number of Pali discourses, where the body endowed with consciousness refers to the human being, distinguished from external objects. So the Buddha is putting the body first in some understanding of the human being. All of these texts suggest that body and mind are closely intertwined, and quite possibly experientially inseparable. If so, liberation must also affect both body and mind, and meditation should transform both. This is possibly the message of the Brahmajala Sutta. We can make an easy conceptual connection between the different ideas. And perhaps this should make us wonder, might these ideas have anything to do with the early Buddhist practice of mindfulness, in which careful attention to the body occupies the primary place? Just as important, might there be an early Buddhist philosophy of mind in which awareness is said to be deeply rooted in the body, perhaps emerging from it? Although never usually interpreted in quite this fashion, a philosophy along these lines is provided by one of the Buddha's chief disciples, Kaccāna, who builds on foundational Buddhist ideas about the dependent origination of cognition. The primary early Buddhist account of cognition is found in the Madhupindika Sutta, where Kaccāna elaborates a brief teaching of the Buddha. This is the Buddha's brief teaching. Although unparalleled in the Pali Suttas, Kaccāna's teaching, and not coming from the Buddha directly, Kaccāna's original points are consistent with all early Buddhist teachings on mind, cognition, and language. Anyway, the starting point of this sutta narrative is the following question of Dandapani the Sakyan to the Buddha. What is the ascetic's teaching? What does he say? And to this the Buddha replies as follows. Teaching in such a way, sir, one abides without quarrel in the world with its gods, Maras and Brahmas, and among people, including its ascetics, Brahmins, gods and men. And in such a way the conceptualizations do not lie dormant in that Brahmin who abides disassociated from sensual pleasures, who is free from doubt, his perplexity cut away, devoid of thirst of being and non-being. I teach thus, sir, I speak thus. This is one of these brief teachings of the Buddha. The story, the teaching gets around to Kaccāna. Certain monks come and ask him for the meaning of this, and Kaccāna interprets as follows. I understand the meaning of the instruction given by the Blessed One in brief, and without a detailed analysis. In detail as follows. Dependent on the eye and forms arises eye sentience. The coming together of all three is contact. From contact there is sensation. What one senses, one apperceives. What one apperceives, one thinks over. What one thinks over, one conceptually proliferates. Because of which conceptual proliferation, apperception, and reckoning afflict a person with regards to all forms of the past, future, and present to be sensed by the eye. It's still quite a brief teaching, not very detailed actually. This scheme is unusually subtle and clear, but it stands on its own as the only early Buddhist treatment of the intellectual problems of cognition. Other Siddhanta schemes are based on the same presuppositions, but focus on affective rather than intellectual malfunctioning. Hence the widely repeated formula of dependent origination, which I'm putting in its cessationist mode here, but you can see the same ideas. And what bhikkhus is the cessation of suffering? Dependent on the eye and forms arises eye sentience. The coming together of all three is contact. From contact there is sensation, from sensation thirst. But with the complete cessation fading away of that thirst, there is the cessation of grasping. From the cessation of grasping, there is the cessation of becoming. From the cessation of becoming, there is the cessation of birth. From the cessation of birth, old age, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, depression, tribulation cease. Thus is the cessation of this entire mass of suffering. A very standard dependent origination teaching. And here we see that the dependent origination formula identifies the effective roots of suffering and offers an easily comprehensible solution to the human problem. The problem is quite simply, easy to grasp from this, it's thirst, the effective problem with cognition. Kaccāna's scheme, let me see if I can go back. Okay, going back to Kaccāna's scheme, we see that it focuses on the less tangible, more subtle, and hence more challenging aspects of dukkha. So his scheme studiously avoids positing an essential subject of cognition. A person's consciousness of objects arises through no volition. The person or perceiver does not act intentionally, not until the higher phases of consciousness. Just as important, the mind is only a faculty. And I've just got the pattern just for eye consciousness, visual awareness. This is repeated for all the different sense faculties, which include the mind. The mind is just something which receives ideas. It's not a thinking machine. So the mind is only a faculty through which mind objects are sensed. It's not a term for a self-conscious subject of cognition. Manas in no way resembles what in modern philosophy is termed mind or consciousness. Yeah. We have a problem with terminology here. These early Buddhist teachings use the word manas. It's usually given as mind or consciousness, but it's totally different to how we use those words in the West. The manas is just an organ like the eye. It would be better to translate it brain, I think. Mind as we know it is the feeling of being an essential subject of cognition. But for Kaccāna, that is just an emergent state of consciousness, defined by the ability to apperceive, verbalize, ideate, and intend. That much, I think, is fairly clear. The meaning of the term vijnana is more complicated. I think it denotes something which could be called pre-noetic sentience, since it arises before the completion of a simple cognitive act. The actual point at which cognition begins is indicated by the term contact. This is the starting point for what we would call consciousness proper. It's the point from which the different qualities of experience can be felt as sensation. Sensation which is pleasure, pain, or neither. And these sensations can then be known and reacted to. The term vijnana is referring to a stage in cognition before this, before the cognitive moment, before transitive awareness, you could say. It seems to be referring to a basic level of sentience, which arises, I suppose, a capacity for sentience, which can be stimulated within the human corpse. On the basis of this, simple objective consciousness arises, and based on that, higher cognitive functions are set in motion, allowing an object to be fully verbalized, known, pondered, and possibly acted upon. So Kaccāna's exposition of the Buddha's teaching, although quite brief, it's an elegant and subtle philosophy of mind, which studiously avoids an essential subject of experience and introduces the idea of emergent levels of conceptual complexity. It also avoids stating a precise causal relationship. We know that contact, the point at which conscious experience begins, it depends on some pre-conscious roots of experience. But Kaccāna does not establish an exact causal relationship between them. The object and sense faculty, which prompts transitive or appetitive sentience, implies a deep somatic basis for vijnana. And perhaps this provides a conceptual basis for the Buddha's claim that his body has lost its connection to being. Kaccāna suggests that if the Buddha has transformed his experience, it goes all the way down to his fingertips, to the deep somatic roots of sentience. And this seems to be what the Buddha implies in the Brahmajala Sutta. Kaccāna has nothing much to say about meditation or mindfulness, not in the Madhupindika Sutta, but his analysis has meditative implications, for he identifies the higher waves of cognitive functioning as that which must be resolved. As we have seen, this idea is based on the Buddha's brief teaching that conceptual proliferation, apperception, and reckoning are problems which beset a person, but which do not affect the liberated Brahmin. Let us now consider another teaching of the Buddha from the Madhupindika Sutta, same text, delivered after his encounter with the Sakyan Dandapani. Upon returning to the Banyan Park in the evening and telling the bhikkhus of Kapilavatthu about his earlier encounter, the Buddha then adds the following point. That isn't it. Here we are. Okay, this is the Buddha's, another teaching the Buddha asks when he goes back to the park where his followers are staying. He's questioned about this teaching and he says this: the source from which conceptual proliferation, apperception, and reckoning afflict a person, if this is not delighted in, approved of, or clung to, just this is the end of the latent tendencies towards passion. It is here that these evil and skillful states cease without remainder. And the Buddha expands upon the evil and skillful states which cease as such things as repulsion, view, doubt, conceit, etc. The Buddha is telling us that the way to liberation is a matter of attending to the source of cognition. If we follow the standard sutta accounts of cognition and Kaccāna's elaboration of them, this would probably mean adopting an attitude of equanimity towards the different elements of contact and possibly sensation. It implies the mindful deconstruction of consciousness, almost to the point of its pre-conscious roots, sense organ, object, and the sentience which arises from them. In other words, Kaccāna's philosophy of mind implies the practice of mindfulness as bare cognition. There has been some debate about this idea of bare cognition. I'll just say here that it's problematic that there don't seem to be any bare cognition, any obvious bare cognition teachings in the Pali Canon. Most of the texts on meditation don't seem to know the idea, and if they do, they don't allow it much importance. The Sāriputta Sutta, a primary source for understanding the Buddha's path, it mentions guarding the senses. We haven't got there yet. Guarding the senses and maintaining mindfulness and clear awareness during mundane daily activities. But these only play a preparatory role in spiritual development. The Sāriputta Sutta, also an extremely important meditation text, has no clearly defined philosophy, and it mentions bare cognition only as a possible approach to practice. It seems strange to start a quote with the word or, but there you go. This is just one, within the standard formula describing Sāriputta, this is one option. Or mindfulness is established by him with the idea there is a body, just to the extent required for a measure of knowledge, a measure of recollection, so that he abides without dependence, not clinging to anything in the world. We are in a very curious position. The meditative implications of the Madhupindika Sutta seem fairly clear, but the major texts on meditation do not seem to draw them. Their focus is instead calm and insight, practices which leave little room for the cultivation of mindfulness, at least in the sense of bare cognition. Let us look at some calm insight practices. We start with the conceptual core of the entire calm insight tradition in Indian Buddhism, which is the Sāriputta Sutta. This text describes a state which occurs after the fourth stage of meditation and which precedes liberating insight, directly precedes it. It describes it as follows: when his mind is thus concentrated, purified, cleansed, without blemish, devoid of defilement, supple, workable still, and in a state of imperturbability, the bhikkhu directs and turns his mind towards the knowledge of the destruction of the corruptions. So here, the mind is apparently an entity which is to be intentionally directed towards specific objects that have to be known apparently at a higher level. The Sāriputta Sutta also identifies the mind as the subject of the liberating experience. We see this in the formula at the bottom. When the bhikkhu knows and sees thus, his mind is freed from the corruptions of sensual pleasure, being and ignorance. When it is released, there is the knowledge it is released, and he understands Birth is destroyed, exhausted, the holy life has been lived. Done is what had to be done, nothing more is required for this state thus. This statement repeated throughout the Pali Canon, there is a big problem in it. At some point in the lectures I'll come back to it. The phrase which is difficult is vimuttasmin vimuttam iti jnanam hoti. I think it's a forgery from an earlier text. It's been forged to make the mind into the subject of liberation. Anyway, what we have here is the idea of the purification and turning of the mind or consciousness towards a preordained end. This idea is found not only in the insight tradition, it is also the basis of purely concentrated approaches to liberation. The only difference lies in what is to be done to the mind or consciousness once it has been sufficiently prepared, whether to apply it to pure ideas or whether to purify it into complete meditative inactivity, to the point of attaining the cessation of sensation and perception, a state also called the deathless element. Let us return to the insight tradition. In some insight texts, meditation is not even mentioned. This does not mean that the person being talked about is not a meditator. It means that the moment of liberation, of liberating insight, is not being described in a meditative state. It's a big difference. The commentarial tradition calls this dry insight. We have a variety of it here in the account of Sāriputta's liberation in the Dīghanaka Sutta. At that time, the Venerable Sāriputta was stood right behind the Blessed One, fanning him. He then had this thought. I should add that the Buddha has given a teaching. Sāriputta is contemplating the teaching that has just been given. This is Sāriputta's thought. The Blessed One apparently advises the abandoning of all these phenomena through understanding. The Blessed One apparently advises the relinquishing of all these phenomena through understanding. While he was reflecting thus, the mind of Venerable Sāriputta was released from the corruptions without grasping. Just as in the Saimanyapala Sutta, Sāriputta focuses the mind on understanding. And the mind, not the person in general, is the subject of liberation. Of course, Sāriputta is the exemplar of the Abhidhamma tradition, and hence the insight approach to practice. But sometimes the early Buddhist composers got rather carried away by the insight claims made for him. In the Vinaya account of the beginnings of Buddhism, Venerable Assaji, one of the first 5 disciples, explains the essence of the Buddha's teaching as follows, in this encounter between Assaji and Sāriputta, who is still a wanderer. And then Venerable Assaji uttered this Dhamma teaching to Sāriputta, the wanderer. Those phenomena which originate from a cause, the Tathagata teaches their cause, and their cessation. The great ascetic teaches thus. And then, having heard this Dhamma teaching, the spotless, untainted insight into Dhamma arose in Sāriputta, the wanderer. Whatever has the nature of arising, all that has the nature of cessation. Now in this is a very long narrative, this Vinaya narrative, beginning with the Buddha's reflections after the awakening. Throughout this Vinaya narrative, the attainment of Dhamma insight is usually preliminary. For example, when it occurs for the very first disciple of the Buddha who gets this formula applied to him is Venerable Kondanya. However, Venerable Kondanya is not liberated, and so the account follows it up with an account of insight proper. Kondanya is liberated by hearing teachings on non-self. Things seem to be different with Sāriputta. The Vinaya does not have anything more than this about Sāriputta, I think. I couldn't find anything anyway. Sāriputta, anyway, goes off to meet his co-religionist Moggallana, and they have the following exchange. Your faculties are tranquil, sir. The colour of your skin is pure and clear. Perhaps you have attained the immortal. Yes, sir, I have attained the immortal. Sāriputta seems here to be claiming full awakening. This is exactly, at least, the same language used by the Buddha when he tries to convince the 5 ascetics of his own awakening right at the very beginning. So when the Buddha has still not gained any followers, he says this: the Tathagata is an arahant bhikkhus, fully awakened. Focus your hearing, the immortal has been attained. I will instruct you, I will teach the Dhamma. I think this Vinaya account is saying that Sāriputta, they've gone too far. Sāriputta, the Paribhajika, has attained liberation in a way that's just unparalleled in the entire Buddhist canon. Whatever the case, the Dighanaka Sutta and Vinaya, they have Sāriputta gaining liberating insight through listening and understanding ideas. These accounts lie towards one end of a soteriological spectrum, which ranges from pure insight at one end to pure meditation at the other, with the Samanyapala Sutta lying in the middle and providing the conceptual center of gravity with a balance of calm and insight. Towards the other end of the spectrum, towards the meditative end of the spectrum, we have another account of Sāriputta's liberation in the Anupada Sutta. We're getting into very complicated territory now. The Anupada Sutta states that Sāriputta, this is the Buddha talking, the Buddha talking about Sāriputta says, Sāriputta spent half a month successively gaining insight into phenomena. Before going, the Buddha then goes through all the different meditative states, describing exactly Sāriputta's insight. So these states are the 4 jhanas and the 4 formless meditations, followed by cessation. Now, in each of the meditative states up until the sphere of nothingness, the Buddha says Sāriputta practices like this. This is Sāriputta's insight practice. So this is the account from the first jhana. Sāriputta, separated from sensual desire and unskillful states, passed his time having attained the first jhana, a state of joy and bliss born from seclusion, possessing reasoning and reflection. The phenomena which occur in the first jhana, reasoning, reflection, joy, bliss, oneness of mind, contact, sensation, apperception, volition, consciousness, will, determination, energy, mindfulness, equanimity, and attention, those phenomena were analyzed successively. Those phenomena were known as they arose, as they endured, and then as they faded away. Sāriputta understood thus. Thus, apparently, these phenomena having not been, they come into being. Having come into being, they disappear. Neither attracted nor averse to those phenomena. Independent, unbound, detached and released from them, he abided with an unrestricted mind and understood there is a higher release. Through focusing on this idea, he became certain there is a higher release. The language is extremely technical. The account is quite long for accounts of liberation, and the final formula in Pali is a little bit obscure. Anyway, it's hard to escape the feeling that this account applies Sāriputta's insight into rise and fall, as stated in the Vinaya, to a new meditative understanding. So the meditative basis for this go all the way up to the sphere of nothingness. The sphere of nothingness is the highest, the peak of consciousness. There is no awareness of an object beyond that. So in each of these states, Sāriputta contemplates the phenomena that occur within them. Okay, now, beyond nothingness, we get to the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception, in which there is no thought and nothing is happening. So Sāriputta can't think about what is going on in the state itself. He has to emerge from it to contemplate what has happened in it. And that is the first contemplation. Having emerged from the state of neither perception nor non-perception, Sāriputta saw into those phenomena which had passed away, ceased, altered as follows. Exactly the same formula now. Thus, apparently, these phenomena having not been, they come into being. Having come into being, they disappear. That is the penultimate state. This is Sāriputta's penultimate insight. After that, he moves beyond the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception and attains the cessation of perception and sensation. Okay, having attained a cessation, the text states, and having seen with insight his corruptions were destroyed. What this simple, vague account of insight means, nobody really knows. I think it's probably artificial. It doesn't mean anything. This is a purely meditative liberation. Anyway, the formula is exactly the same, and it's quite strange. You would think that after having liberating insight, panya, Sāriputta wouldn't need to be contemplating anything else, but the stereotypical formula is applied to him. I think we're in quite artificial territory. The Anupada Sutta. This is towards the meditative end of the spectrum. Here is a rough typology, ranging from pure insight to pure meditation. So at the pure insight end of the spectrum, we have the Dighanaka Sutta. That is where Sāriputta is fanning the Buddha and contemplating the teaching he has just heard. In the middle, we have the Samannapala Sutta. You get to the fourth jhana, you can then attain liberating insight. There are other calm insight texts where you can attain insight directly from the earlier stages of meditation, such as the Atthakkanagara Sutta. Above and beyond the Samannapala Sutta, that's the Anupada Sutta we have just seen. Finally, the pure meditation approach. You have it in a couple of suttas which focus on cessation. It is sometimes called the deathless element, or the immortal state. Texts like the Nivāpa or Mahachunda Suttas, they have no interest in insight. Sometimes they are outright hostile to it. This typology shows that calm and insight can sometimes stand in almost complete opposition. Reducing the mind to a state of no thought or experience is quite different from having experience and contemplating its true nature. At the present, we are trying really to find if there is any room for a mindfulness-based soteriology, just as our inquiry into embodiment and cognition suggests. This brief survey shows nothing like it. Let us put the philosophical difference as follows. So for Kaccāna, the experience of mind or consciousness, as we use these terms in the West, what we refer to by these terms, is a constructed or conditioned state of consciousness. This implies that conditioning must be undone. Whatever state of awareness that is normal for us, that has to be deconstructed, seemingly through paying mindful attention to the sensory and somatic roots of experience. For Sāriputta and the calm insight tradition, the experience of mind or consciousness, that is, our normal waking state, must be conditioned in a certain way. Proper conditioning like this allows either for a higher form of knowledge or a state of non-experience. We seem to have detected an apparent discrepancy in early Buddhist thought and practice. Kaccāna's philosophy was apparently unknown or was discarded at the soteriological level, and its place was taken by a different understanding of meditation. An understanding of meditation in which Sāriputta is the important figure. The theories of calm and insight seem to be based on a different philosophy. And what might this be? In fact, we don't have to look very far for an answer. Curiously, the Pali discourses contain a different philosophy of mind, related most prominently to Sāriputta again, and these seem to explain the calm insight soteriologies. So, from the top we have the Mahavedala Sutta, where Sāriputta tells Mahakotika the following: it perceives, sir, therefore it is called perception. And what does it perceive? It perceives pleasure, pain, and neither pleasure nor pain. We are talking about vijnana, consciousness or perception. The subject of the verbs in this first citation is unclear. We don't know who is the subject of this verb vijjanati, to know, to perceive. The verb could refer to the term vijnana itself, but perhaps the intended meaning is that a person's act of perception is achieved through vijnana. But whatever the case, it is obvious that the term vijnana is close in meaning to the English word consciousness, a person's normal waking state of awareness felt to be the experiencer of things. A similar version of cognition is again proposed by Sāriputta in the Mahahati-Padopama Sutta, which is the second citation here. This is more important. When a person's eye is not impaired and external visible forms come into its range, and there is an appropriate act of attention, thus the appearance of that type of consciousness comes to be. There can be little doubt about the meaning of Sāriputta's teaching here, as the verb used, samanaharati, is equivalent to the verb manasi karoti, and both refer to intentional acts of attention. This is about consciousness in the sense of attention. And this is quite different from Kaccāna. Kaccāna uses vijnana differently. Vijnana for Kaccāna is not an act of intention. The last citation is from the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta, a complicated inside text. After outlining a non-self contemplation, the Buddha states the resultant state of purified mind allows a person to comprehend experience accurately. So in the bottom citation, this is coming after a contemplation has been described. So we have a resultant state of consciousness. Only consciousness remains purified and cleansed, by which one knows something. One perceives pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain. The understanding of consciousness in this teaching is close to the Samannapala Sutta, the Samannapala Sutta's use of mind. Both refer to a purified or cleansed state of awareness, which can be directed towards objects of knowledge. We must allow for a variety of uses for general terms such as vijnana and citta, but we should pay close attention when there seem to be different philosophies involved. That seems to be the case here. Let us pause for a moment to reflect. Perhaps the two understandings of consciousness are complementary. Perhaps one can speak of consciousness in different ways, and they don't need to be contrasted. Perhaps these different ways of speaking of consciousness can be used in the same spiritual practice. This is possible. We will have to explore this idea, but I think it is unlikely. I think it is far more likely we are dealing with different philosophies of mind and meditation. Consider, for example, I'm going out of the Pali Canon now, a Dharmaguptaka version of insight after the fourth jhana. So this comes after the fourth jhana and before the knowledges which are described the same in both the Dharmaguptaka and Pali text. So the Dharmaguptakas add this: it is just like a private room that has been plastered inside and outside and whose door has been firmly shut and locked. with no wind or dust entering. Inside, a lamp has been lit, which nobody touches or agitates. The flame of that lamp rises quietly and without perturbation. Here, the mind has been quite literally placed in a box, separated from mundane experience and focused on liberating insight. This box looks exactly like an Indian Buddhist version of the Cartesian theatre of mind. It could not be further away from the notion of a cadaver endowed with perception and mind. It is completely different from the idea of a Tathagata's embodiment having no connection with being. Cartesian dualism, according to which the mind in its own realm perceives objects, is close in spirit to the insight text we have considered here. So we return to the point that according to Sāriputta's philosophy of mind, there is simply no point in developing mindfulness. If your aim is to put the mind in a box, why be aware of the body? There's no point. There's no need to cultivate a specific attitude to the roots of cognition. Now, let's just think, if this analysis is correct, what does it mean? It would mean that Sāriputta is deeply misguided and his liberations, plural, impossible. If mind or consciousness is distributed through the body as the capacity for simple pre-noetic sentience, if mind does not reside in an inner palace, a box or the Cartesian theatre, then trying to put it into that box is seriously misconceived. Meditative concentration would seem to be an attempt to achieve the impossible, and the practice of calm insight meditation an obstacle to awakening, a hindrance rather than a help. If our analysis is correct, the ramifications would be significant. We are saying that the calm insight tradition is in disagreement with dependent origination, and hence is most likely a deviation from an earlier understanding. This is no doubt contentious and probably controversial. At some point, we will want to know how and why the deviation took place. We will also demand answers to such questions as, how can Buddhist meditation be understood apart from the ideas of calm and insight? As far as the general understanding goes, Buddhist meditation is calm and insight. There is no Buddhist meditation that is not calm and insight. We beg to differ. We believe the earliest form of meditation can and should be understood differently. Not entirely without the ideas of calm and insight, but not guided by them either. We will instead take our lead from two Buddhist concepts which we believe the calm insight tradition pushed into the background, already in the very early days of Buddhism. These are mindfulness, sati, and absorption, jhana. Before inquiring into these ideas, using Kaccāna's philosophy of mind as a guide, further conceptual analysis of the insight tradition will be required. We are not done with Sāriputta yet. But understanding the errors of the calm insight tradition will help us better understand the true philosophical basis of early Buddhist meditation. From this point, we can take a new path, not exactly into uncharted territory, but into territory long since abandoned. We will venture into the wasteland of the oldest Buddhist tradition, the path to which is overgrown and barely visible. Luckily for us, all the signposts are still in place. All that is required is to remove the jungle thickets of tradition and the overgrowth of received ideas, so that a fresh interpretation can be attempted. The early Buddhists left an incredible amount of conceptual artifacts and debris behind, and these were not totally forgotten, even when ideas moved on and new paths were forged. Luckily for us, the intellectual products of the Indian Buddhist genius were never thrown away. Old traditions were not destroyed. They were merely moved into new buildings, into outhouses and storerooms where they gathered dust, became illegible and fell apart. So we here make a start in reassembling the edifice of thought afresh, in trying to understand whether it makes any sense. For we ultimately want to know, is Buddhist awakening a plausible idea, a concept that makes sense of life and provides a purpose to it? Thank you.